Transformation by Ho Tzu Nyen. Sorry. The talk will start with artist presentation, followed by a discussion with Tyler Rollins and Gridthiya Gaweewong. This event is made possible by the support from the Foundation for the Spirituality of the Arts in New York City. And for some of you who might have known, this talk is the expanded version interconnected with Tzu Nyen's previous talk at the FSA on philosophy, traditions, and history with spiritual themes. So before we start, for some people who came here for the first time, I would like to introduce you to our director, Gridthiya Gaweewong. She is the artistic director of the Thompson Art Center in Bangkok, and last year, together with Gridthiya, she directed the Thailand Biennale 2023 in Chiang Rai. Gridthiya is one of the best-known curators working in Southeast Asia, and this year she recently received the Audrey Ermes Award for Curatorial Excellence from the Center of Curatorial Studies, Bard College. And she also appointed as one of the finding committees for an artistic director of Documenta 16. So next to her role at the Art Center, she also guest curator for Maiyam Contemporary Art Museum in Chiang Mai. And she co-founded the Bangkok Experimental Film Festival with Apichat Pongvirasetakul, with its comeback for the 7th edition of the festival in the late January this year. Her upcoming curatorial projects address issues of social change faced by artists from Thailand and beyond, starting with the Cold War exhibition in collaboration with Bangkok Art and Culture Center. Next, I Understand Everything, a solo show by Almagut for the Almaty Art Museum in Kazakhstan, and curated with Angrit Achariya Thai Pavilion for Cheongju Craft Biennale in Cheongju, South Korea. So now, I would like to invite Gridthiya Gaweewong on the stage to briefly talk about this collaboration. Please go.
Hello everyone. My name is Gridthiya. Thank you for your nice introduction. And on behalf of the Thompson Art Center and the Foundation, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight to spend time with Ho Tzu Nyen and our discussion with Tyler. So this talk is, as Nara already informed, it was a special event following Ho Tzu Nyen's show at the Bard College in New York and his presentation as MoMA, supported by the Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts and Asia Arts Archive, and partially supported by Maiyam and our foundation, the James H. Thompson Foundation. So we are delighted to host this follow-up program here in Bangkok to reflect and continue the discussion about his exhibition as well as his talk, which actually the project that you will see here tonight was originated from his kind of umbrella project, which is a critical dictionary of Southeast Asia. So in this session, we explore the works of Ho Tzu Nyen, which is a renowned artist from Singapore. And some of you may have seen his, actually like the first original, before he traveled around the world, at Singapore Art Museum last year, which is quite very impressive. And he will talk more about that. Before we begin, let me introduce you to Ho Tzu Nyen, a remarkable artist from Singapore who began his career in the early 2000s. And I first encountered his work at the very cool small alternative space in Singapore called Substation. And it is very interesting project, to found someone in Singapore and who was interested in an alternate history. And he was talking about, the birth of the nation and its founder. So since then, his practice has drawn from diverse Eastern and Western culture reference, spanning art history, theater, cinema, music, and philosophy. Ho Tzu Nyen's works blend mythical narrative and historical facts, challenging conventional understanding of history and its transmission. So a central theme in his work is always about the exploration of Southeast Asia's rich plurality, its language, religion, and culture, defining simplicities the definitions. So his immersive and theatrical installation combine archival images, animation, film, weaving together knowledge, narrative, and representation. So Ho Tzu Nyen has held solo exhibitions at prominent venues such as the Ho Tzu Museum of Art in Bart, Thompson Art Center in Seoul, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo in Tokyo, and of course Singapore Art Museum, right? So also at Hammer Museum, Toyota Municipal Museum of Art, Yamaguchi Center for Arts and Media. So it's a long list of CV. If you wanted to know more, he has very interesting and extensive website. So please check it out. And so Ho will give about 45 minutes presentation, and followed by the discussion with Tyler Rollins and me. And let me introduce Tyler Rollins. With over 20 years in New York contemporary art scene, he is a leading advocate for our region, Southeast Asia, and expanded to sometimes Asia Pacific artists. He was graduated from the Yale University with advanced degree from London School of Economics, and on the way of his PhD program in NYU, he stopped doing PhD and he turned into the artworks and being like one of the leaders of the gallery representing the Southeast Asian artists. So he's been working with many leading Southeast Asian artists, especially from Thailand. He has been working with the I Pinari, who is one of the board of the foundation, and Ajahn Araya, that guy, and also with Sophia Pitch. And he was one of the leading galleries from Chelsea that many museums and institutions highly respect. And I think it was really interesting and a little bit sad that you closed the gallery. So he has been, the gallery showcase work of the top fairs like Basel, Frieze, Miami, and placing out the museum shows at the Met, Guggenheim, Pompidou, and also the Tate Modern. So known for exploring themes of spirituality and cultural traditions, Tyler launched the Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts in 2021 to strengthen connections between art and faith. So he will share more about the foundation right now. So could you please come up and say a few words about your foundation? Please welcome.
All right, thank you. And I just want to thank the Thompson Art Center and also the foundation for supporting our programs in New York. And it's just a thrill to be able to bring it here into the Southeast Asian context after having discussed a lot of these issues in the New York context. So people often wonder, why did I start this organization? And it's really that in at least the visual art world, there's been a great disconnect in recent decades between the art conversation and the conversation around connectivity with spirituality, which extends from a personal private sphere to the communal expression of that in religious faith and other traditions. I guess I view creativity and spirituality as coming from the same space and part of the same flow or process. I call it a process of inspired relationality. So this idea of relationship, which I think is so central to artistic production, and also a certain psychological orientation that we have towards something beyond ourselves. It involves breaking the patterns of habit and ego to be receptive to something, and then to be able to let that flow through and communicate to others or to be joined in communion. This is often the process that we see at the origin of artistic creativity and expression as well. And so that is the kind of narrative that is often sort of left out of certain conversations. So part of our mission, in addition to nurturing artists and commissioning new, particularly writings and artworks, is to really facilitate the expansion of the discourse around art to include this lens of the spiritual alongside the many other issues that we talk about in terms of politics, environment, other sorts of issues. So this lens is perhaps a little more fragile and I think can benefit from a certain level of nurturing, which is what Foundation for Spirituality in the Arts is really all about. So it was such a pleasure working with Sue in New York, and I think I will pass it on to him now. If we should do that. All right, thank you.
Hello everyone, good evening. First of all, thank you for having me here, for everyone that's responsible for bringing me here. And thank you all of you for being here as well. So without much further ado, I will begin this talk. I will speak for about 45 minutes. I'm not a very good timekeeper, so Tyler, maybe you could give me a sign when it's like when we have 15 minutes left. Yeah, so I'll jump right into it. As was introduced earlier, the title of my talk today is T for Tiger, T for Time, and T for Transformation. So as you notice, the title has 3 parts. So the talk has a 3-part structure. The last time when we did it in New York, we couldn't finish. We only did 2 parts. So today I will try harder. So let's begin with the first part, T for Tigers. So tigers is a motif that I have been working on for about 10 years or so. So I would like to explain a little bit the origins of my obsession or interest in tigers. So first of all, just a very brief introduction into this project, which was mentioned earlier. This is called the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. I can't really speak about this project now because that will take up 45 minutes easily. But in short, if I'm to describe this project in a succinct way, I would say it's an attempt to define Southeast Asia through moving images and sung words. And it's a work that is algorithmically edited because the story of Southeast Asia is itself always changing. So it's a video that is never the same, it's edited in real time. So in this dictionary was first devised when I was thinking of a different way to reimagine Southeast Asia. I think we will speak about this later in the conversation. Southeast Asia, which is a kind of a paradoxical construction. But anyway, the dictionary is made up of 26 terms, 26 because there are 26 letters in the English alphabet. And under T, we have T for tigers. So anyone who's interested in the dictionary, you can go onto this website where we have the work constantly streaming and being edited and transforming in real time. So let me speak a little bit about tigers. So tigers, actually, maybe I will start again with Southeast Asia. So 1 million years ago, actually, Southeast Asia was a single landmass known as the Sunda Shelf. So about 1 million years ago, tigers started to disperse across all of Southeast Asia before sea levels rose and broke Southeast Asia into its current shape. So 1 million years ago is actually prior to the formation of the modern human brain. So Homo sapiens have not quite evolved to our state yet, but tigers were already in Southeast Asia. So everywhere in Southeast Asia, actually, we find myths about tigers, especially I would say in the Malay world. Tigers are kind of a special animal. In the ancient kind of Malay animist cosmologies, tigers are something that we associate closely with the ancestral. So it is said that ancestral spirits use tigers as a kind of vehicle. So they travel through by going into the bodies of tigers. And in Southeast Asia, there is also the myth that certain humans have the ability to transform into tigers. I think Apichatpong's great film, Tropical Melody, featured a powerful instance of a were-tiger. It is also said that shamans, for example, have the ability to transform into tigers. And tigers, in many ways, are creatures of the borders. So, counter to our intuition, we sometimes imagine that tigers live in the forest, but they don't. So they live actually at the outskirts of the forest. So they live in the border zone between the forest and water, like a river. Yeah. So shamans who are able to transform into tigers, in a way, are also some kind of beings who exist at the borders between civilization and what is outside of it. So tigers are also creatures of transformation. So T for transformation kind of makes sense here because of this ability for humans and tigers to transform into each other. So I'd just like to share these quotes. This is actually written by a person called Ma Huan. Ma Huan was the interpreter of the great Ming Dynasty navigator, Cheng Ho, Admiral Cheng Ho. So Cheng Ho came to Malaysia, actually specifically to Malacca, and Ma Huan was his interpreter. And this was what Ma Huan recorded. In the town, there are tigers which can assume human form. They enter the markets and walk about, mixing with the populace. If anyone recognized one of these creatures, he would seize it and kill it. This is a photograph that I found in an early anthropological scholarly book written by two English colonial officials who were also scholars. The book is called Pagan Races of the Malay Peninsula, and this is supposed to be a photograph of a were-tiger, but there are no explanations why it's a were-tiger. We are just faced with this photograph. The next image that I wanted to show you is a print made by a German artist called Heinrich Leutemann. This was made around 1885, and it actually records an actual event that happened in Singapore in 1835. So an Irish man whose name is George Dromgold Coleman. He led a survey mission into the forests of Singapore. The purpose was to create gambia and pepper plantations because that was in demand at that time. And this survey mission was interrupted when a tiger leapt out at the expedition. Interestingly, the tiger didn't kill or attack any humans, but what the tiger did was that it went straight for the instrument or the machine, which is called a theodolite. A theodolite is the most expensive instrument used for triangulation for the survey. So the tiger kind of knew what it was doing by attacking the machine. And George Dromgold Coleman, interestingly, was the first urban planner of Singapore, the chief architect, chief surveyor, and also chief superintendent of prisons. We will speak about that a little bit later. But anyway, this clash, this beautiful print kind of shows this binary clash in a way. On the one side, we have George Dromgold Coleman dressed in white, who as a surveyor represents order and rationality, and on the other side we have the tiger, which in a way is is an indigenous force of chaos. So using this idea, I started to develop a few works. I will just speak about one of them here, and this is a work called One or Several Tigers. This was one of the last works that I made about tigers. So what you see here is a two-channel projection, so on two screens, and the two screens are facing each other. And on one screen, we have a tiger, and on the other side, we have the surveyor. So the tiger and the surveyor are singing a duet. And this duet is about this 1 million years of tiger histories from Singapore, where I'm from. So that in a way, the audience stands in between these two screens. And the tiger and the surveyor, they sometimes start to revolve and switch positions. So this work was actually my first attempt at using animation, and this was done using a process for working in 3D animation. So in 3D animation, you basically create figures, three-dimensional figures that almost follow our kind of like Euclidean laws of space. But these shells are almost like puppets, they are hollow. So in order to move these shells, you need to insert data into them. The way in which we did this was that we suspended an actor from the ceiling. This actor was actually also the singer who sings both the parts of the tiger and the surveyor. And while singing, he is moving his body. And we capture all of these motions. This is a process known as motion capture. And this data is then inserted into these hollow shells. So when I was working on this project, it suddenly struck me that this process I'm describing was exactly analogous to this animistic idea of the tiger as a hollow shell where an ancestral spirit could kind of like enter. So in a way, animism is defined by transmigration of souls, that souls can move between bodies. So it's interesting that with this new technology, there's this kind of like a parallel in structure. And so these are more stills. And I started also thinking about the word animals, animation, animism. So they all share the same root word, which is anima and animus, which are terms which refer to the soul. So in a way, a body moves because a soul enters it and breathes life into it. So the other main property that interested me in working with animation was the propensity for animation to transform. So from its earliest beginnings, animation has always been about the transformation of the body. So animated characters can stretch, they can transform their shapes, they can shift. So even human-animal combinations was also at the beginning of animation. So if you think about Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, actually if you ever encounter Mickey Mouse in real life, it's I think quite scary, like a human-mice combination. Yeah. So this also kind of connects with the shape-shifting abilities of the tiger in our histories. So these kind of connections became increasingly interesting for me. So in the work, the tiger is kind of continuously shifting and changing its form. So we'll look at some of these stills and its different kind of like transformations of the tiger. This, I guess, is a kind of a sadder transformation when the tiger has been reduced to just skin. Yeah. And eventually the work kind of enables Coleman to meet with the tiger, and we gradually recompose this image. So this is one of the screens in one or several tigers, and this screen is retractable. So at a certain moment in the work, the screen lifts up, and we see behind the screen a set of shadow puppets. So these are shadow puppets carved out from buffalo skin in the tradition of wayang kulit, that's what we call it. And it was always interesting to me that wayang kulit is a kind of what we call back projection. So the puppets are behind the screen and you throw a light on it. Whereas most of the projectors that we use today, we use it as a front projection. So for me, this screen is almost kind of like supercharged with both front and back projection, and also these different histories of screen technologies, I would say. But anyway, shortly after this encounter with tigers and humans, in Singapore, we began a war against tigers because the forests need to be cleared, and the more people we send into the forest to clear the forest, the more they encounter tigers, and the tigers started to develop a taste for human flesh. And this situation became so serious that people didn't want to work in the forest anymore. So the companies and the colonial administration started a war against tigers. So the most effective way is to set a bounty so tigers can be killed and exchanged for cash. And this is the reason why tigers have become completely extinct in Singapore. But for me, the story of tigers doesn't end with its physical extinction. So in a way, for me, my story is about how tigers continuously return. I want to speak a little bit about this slide. So this is about the beginning of the Second World War. Actually, we often think of Japan's entry into the Second World War as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but actually at the same time, they started an invasion of Malaya. So I remember Winston Churchill once said that the defeat of the British in Malaya was the greatest defeat ever suffered by the British Empire. And there were many reasons for the defeat, but one of them was that they were completely unprepared for the way that the Japanese forces were able to move in the forest. So they thought of the Japanese soldiers as being very swift in the forest, and they were also amphibious, which means that they can move on water and land. And they were also said to be very savage and cunning. And actually all of these are the same kind of qualities we used to project on tigers before. And the leader of the Japanese army was General Tomoyoki Yamashita, and he was widely known as the Tiger of Malaya. So for me, the tigers return now in a different form as metaphors. So after the end of the Second World War, tigers as a metaphor was also used a lot to describe another group of people, and these were the Malayan communists. So after the Second World War, there was a kind of what we call the emergency, but it was effectively a civil war, where the communists tried to take over Malaya through force. And very often, communists were referred to as tigers. And sometimes I think about this, in a way, those moments as we are all kind of like familiar with, those moments of struggle with the communists, was kind of a period of great paranoia, because one doesn't know who exactly is a communist. Communism is something that hides inside, and it can be disguised. So this makes me think about the earlier quote by Ma Huan, who speaks about trying to identify tigers in the town, and if they identified them, they would have to be killed. So again, for me, the tigers return, but in a different form, as metaphors. But I want to speak a little bit about the word metaphor. So if we trace the Greek roots of the word metaphor, which is metaphorein, it actually means to transfer or to carry over. So in other words, a metaphor is a kind of container, a kind of medium that can contain something that allows it to pass through some kind of borders. And I sometimes think of this work, One or Several Tigers, as a kind of ritual. What I mean is that on the two screens, you always have characters in the work looking at each other. So sometimes I think that this work doesn't require a human audience because the audience has already been built into the work. Yeah. So this kind of, in a way, it's kind of self-contained. And when human audiences wander into this work, if they are looking at the tiger, it also means that they are embodying the perspective of the surveyor. And if they are looking at the surveyor, they are also taking on the point of view of the tiger. So this was something that interested me a lot. I think earlier Jack mentioned that I had a show, like a survey show at the Singapore Art Museum, which was called Time and the Tiger. And while working on the catalog, one of the curators started interviewing me about my childhood, and I started, actually only this year, started thinking about something that happened to me when I was in kindergarten. So basically, my best friend's father was a medium. And it just also so happened that my nanny, who was taking care of me, was part of his circle of followers. So I spent many, many afternoons actually in the house of the medium, and I witnessed many of these ceremonies of like spirit possession. So the spirit that possesses that enters into the medium is called, in Chinese, is a Chinese deity called Nera, who's also known as the third prince. Yeah. And what I remembered most intensely was that at kind of like the climax of the ritual, the medium would take a knife and slice the knife through his cheeks, entering from one side to the other. So this image, and he would then pull the knife out. So these two red slits on his two sides of his cheeks and his eyes, which was kind of bulging red, is forever imprinted in my mind. Yeah. So this is a photograph, not of the actual medium that I experienced, but this is from Singapore, and it's a kind of spirit possession ceremony in a domestic setting. So it was very close to what I was experiencing many afternoons when I was a kid. So now I move to the second part of the presentation, T for time. So this was a work that was produced as a new work that was produced for the survey show. And I decided that I wanted to kind of like take the time to think about time, because as a moving image artist, in many ways, I think that time is the true material that I work with. But thinking and speaking about time is one of the most difficult things to do. St. Augustine, the Christian philosopher, he once said that everybody thinks that they know what time is until they are asked to speak about it. So I find myself in that situation now, trying to speak about time. Let's try. Yeah. So for this work, there are kind of like two parts to this new work that I produce, and I will just do a quick introduction. This is the first part of the work, which is called Timepieces. It is basically made up of 44 very small screens of different shapes and sizes, and each of them depicts some kind of time passing or some kind of a clock. A timepiece is basically a way to describe a clock, something that counts time. Right? So for me, this part, the timepieces, there are altogether 42 timepieces in it. So for me, my work about time has 42 chapters in it. So in a way, I think of the timepieces as almost a condensed page of a book about time. Yeah. And the book itself, the novel, is the second part of the project, which is called T for Time. Basically, in T for Time, I tell the stories behind these 42 chapters, behind these 42 timepieces. And it's a work which is also edited algorithmically. So it's edited in real time and it's different with every loop. So this is going back to the timepieces. And I now want to spend a little bit of time to speak about a few of these timepieces. It's impossible to speak about 42 of them. So we will just kind of like zoom in on specific timepieces. So I just want to zoom in on one of these timepieces, kind of like in the middle, and that's actually a pendulum. Yeah. So, Galileo, the Renaissance scientist, was said to have discovered the laws of the pendulum, that the pendulum kind of swings in a regular interval, right? So in a way, the pendulum is the essence of the Western clock. So a pendulum can be described as a simple harmonic oscillator, and it is at the core of the development of the modern Western clock. The history of clockmaking itself can be described as the search for ever more reliable forms of oscillations. It means that the oscillations need to take place at precisely the same intervals. Right? So this timepiece, also just to explain a little bit the work, it's a video. And this video is only 1 second long because it only needs to show the pendulum moving once, and we put it on a loop, so it's eternal. So for the different timepieces that I made, some of them were videos, some of them are apps, and I will speak about this difference a little bit later. And this is another timepiece amongst the 42 timepieces. And this one is called Water Clock. And this is actually part of a replica of a giant water clock built in China in the Northern Song period, so between around 960 AD. And this ancient water clock is regarded by scientists as the most accurate clock in the world at that time. So what you see in the earlier slide is the part of the wheel that moves, that turns all the gears in the clock, and it's moved using the weight of water. So this is the clock tower itself. Yeah. So here I just want to think a little bit about the difference between this clock and the pendulum. Yeah. So in order for a water clock to work, we still need an external input, which is water, a natural element that flows. Yeah. But the difference with the pendulum is that in a way, the pendulum becomes self-contained. It moves kind of like on its own using the force of gravity. And according to certain historians of science, with this water clock was commissioned by the emperor. And it is said that the emperor has no interest in mundane time, in the time of our everyday life. Rather, this clock is built in order to track the movement of the stars. So the emperor is only interested in cosmic time, but not our mundane time, So it's a kind of an interesting contrast for me that the Western clock no longer requires this input of a natural element and becomes self-contained and autonomous, whereas this ancient kind of like Chinese clock still requires the flow of water, and at the same time it opens itself up to the stars rather than our mundane everyday life. So in a way, this is kind of an interesting contrast of these different types of attitudes on time. This is another timepiece, and this is called solar system rotation. So this is basically an app. And this app has all the different, how long it takes for every single planet in our solar system to turn one round. So how many days, how long is one day on different planets? This is another timepiece, and it's called H4, Harrison's chronometer. I'll explain a little bit. So throughout the 18th century, various European powers with colonial and imperial designs actually offered rewards for the accurate measurement of what we call the longitude. You need to know the longitude in order to navigate safely. And when the longitude was not discovered, it led to many great sea tragedies. So it's interesting to me as well that the English were the most advanced clockmakers in the 18th and 19th century. And this also meant that their navigation was precise. And of course, this coincided with their empire, which kind of spanned across the world. Yeah. So in order to measure longitude accurately, you need a clock that can carry the original time of where you set sail from. And this was extremely difficult. Like many great European scientists tried to solve this problem for more than 100 years, and it couldn't be solved. Eventually, it was solved by a carpenter whose name is John Harrison, and this was the clock that solved it, and he gained a huge reward after spending 50 years of his life cracking it, but he died 3 years after he got the reward. This is another timepiece, and this is, some of you might find this familiar. This is actually a reconstruction of the American conceptual artist Felix Gonzalez Torres's great work, which is called Perfect Lovers. It's already 15 minutes. Yeah. So for speaking about time, I'm terribly bad at keeping time, but yeah. So anyway, Gonzalez Torres very beautifully, it's basically, originally it's two actual clocks that are always in sync, and he called it Perfect Lovers. And he says love is like this pair of clocks until one clock starts to fall out of sync. So I recreated this as an app. So these two clocks are forever in sync. So it's a perfect love forever. But I'm not sure if this actually improves the artwork. Maybe the work is better that one eventually falls out of sync. This is something which kind of amused me. I was kind of looking into the histories of time in Asia, and it seems that the North Koreans constantly shift their time half an hour forward or backward in relation to South Korean time. So when relationship is good with South Korea, they will synchronize, but when it's bad, they will desynchronize. Yeah. So this immediately made me think of the work. Yeah. So maybe I might have to start to skip a little bit of these timepieces because each one takes a bit of time to explain. I mean, but maybe I want to speak a little bit about this one. This is a kind of a visualization of a light clock. So the most advanced clock of our time is a conceptual clock that hasn't yet existed. It's a clock that uses light. And this was something imagined by Einstein. So in a way, the whole theory of concepts of relativity came out of many of his thought experiments, which requires this kind of theoretical conceptual clocks. Yeah. Interestingly, at the time when Einstein was thinking about this, he was working in a patent office in Switzerland, and he looked through many patent applications about time synchronization. So to be able to synchronize different clocks in the city was a huge project that many European city-states tried to embark on. Yeah. So this kind of daily dealing with clocks must have sort of inspired him to go down this path of imagining clocks, right? So just very quickly, if we imagine that red dot as a light, kind of bouncing up and down, it almost functions like the pendulum's swing. Yeah. So Einstein's whole kind of concept was, if one clock on top is stationary and the clock at the bottom is moving, does time move equally for both clocks? And the answer is no. And it's not that one clock is less accurate, it is simply that time moves differently. Yeah. So I will skip this maybe, and skip this. And maybe I will speak about this timepiece, which is called apple peel. This is kind of a bit of a complicated one, but I want to try speaking about it. First of all, when you are peeling an apple, the skin that you peel off is often in a spiral shape. And actually the spiral is one of the main shapes of time. We imagine time as a straight line, as a circle, or as a spiral. You know, these are the common shapes of time. But in 1984, there was a Japanese novel written by Atsushi Mori. And I won't go into the novel, but the last scene in one of his stories has a saxophonist sort of peeling an apple. And Atsushi Mori begins to speak about these acts of peeling the skin of an apple. And I just want to read the passage because it's a beautiful one. Atsushi Mori says, given that the blade, which progressively slides from the bottom to the top, is one-dimensional space called time, the apple's stalk becomes points at infinity, to which the one-dimensional space called time returns again, forming a circle. Yeah. So I will just kind of leave it at that. This is an image from T for Time, and is engaging with this the apple, the story behind the apple peeling. And I want to also say that all of the animation that I created for T for Time is based on existing footage. So in this case, this apple peeling was based on the film by the great Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu. The film is called Late Spring. So all of Ozu's later films, actually, the film titles all have something to do with time. It's late spring, early autumn, you know, so it's always to do with this passing season. But in this film, the main character, his name is Professor Shukichi. The story is about him, the whole film is about him trying to marry off his daughter. He's a widower. And his daughter is 27 years old and she wants to stay with her father, but he's trying to get her married. So at the end of the film, he finally succeeds in marrying her off. And here we are seeing kind of a blurred image of him returning home after the marriage ceremony. So he succeeded in his plan. And he begins kind of like taking off his jacket. And the last scene is him sitting down and peeling this apple. This kind of like, in a sense, evoking this passing of time. So I will skip all of those previous images, but kind of going, back into this apple peeling and this creation of these spiral shapes. And this in turn leads me to the next timepiece that I made. This is called Tiger Tail. This is based on the Ouroboros. Some of you might be familiar with the image of the snake biting its own tail, but in my case, I have replaced the snake with a tiger. Yeah. And I just want to read as well a short passage from Borges, the Argentinian writer. He says, "Time is a river that sweeps me along, but I am the river. Time is a tiger that mangles me, but I am the tiger. Time is a fire that consumes me, but I am the fire." So these are again more scenes from Late Spring that we used for the work. This is Professor Shukichi with his daughter on their last holiday before she gets married, and he's packing his books. So I'm like always interested as to this specific book which Ozu framed very precisely to show us what the book is. So the book actually is a book by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So Thus Spoke Zarathustra was critical for Nietzsche when he came up with the concept of the eternal return that time is an eternal return rather than a straight line. Yeah. So how much time do I have?
More time. Yeah, more time.
10 minutes, yeah. Sorry, yes. Just want to speak very quickly about this, which is a river. So earlier I mentioned about metaphors, and the only way we seem to be able to speak about time is through metaphors. One of the most popular metaphors is that time is a river, but if you think about it, the metaphor doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like if time is the river, what are the river banks and what is the river bed? And why does this river flow in one direction and not the other? You know. So this is another timepiece that I made, which is and also a river, but it's an app. So it runs for 24 hours and it changes from like day to night. I want to speak now about this timepiece, which is a family photograph from a Japanese friend and collaborator whose name is Tomoyuki Arai. So his father basically, some years ago, he told me that his father gave him a Blu-ray disc containing his entire family photographs and family home movies, and his father destroyed all the original analog prints to save space. And he put it on the Blu-ray disc because his father thought that was the most advanced medium of our time. And my friend Tomo doesn't have any disc players of any kind. So when I got the money to do the project, I helped to digitize, the entire collection. But this photographs, it interested me a lot because somehow looking at this, so Tomoyuki is Japanese and 1 year older than I am, but when I look at the family photographs, I feel like they could almost be my family photographs, probably because we were both from the same kind of like social class, and we were living through a time of the economic boom in Asia in the 80s. But through this one story, we can think about time in different ways. The time of media, different mediums. Media is always getting outdated today. We can think of the different time in a photograph, in an original analog photograph where time is directly imprinted. And we can think about what happens when these photographs are digitized. Because to digitize something changes essentially the object, so it becomes a different type of time. So this set of family photographs that I use a lot interested me a lot in this way. And maybe the last protagonist of T for Time that I would like to share with you today is this. So I moved to a new studio 2 years ago, and by chance I got along very well with an old gentleman he's like 81 years old now, who takes care of the building where my studio is in. And he told, at that time I was researching on T for Time, and this old gentleman told me that he is a caretaker of public clocks in Singapore. And he's been taking care of this one particular clock, the most prominent public clock in Singapore at the Victoria Theatre in Singapore. He's been taking care of the clock for 30 years. And it's a mechanical clock, so it needs to be wound. It hasn't been digitized. And he's very proud that this is still an original, authentic clock. And he needs to wind this clock every 3 hours, every 3 days. So he hasn't been able to take a holiday for more than 3 days for 30 years. So much as I respect his care and dedication, he's also a kind of prisoner of time. So I followed him up to the clock tower to see how he, adjusts the clock. And then in order to wind the clock to the correct time, he needs to check the time. And he checks the time by taking out his mobile phone to see what the time is. So this was a kind of a big kind of like paradoxical kind of like a contradiction. So again, through this one story, we can think about time in different ways. And maybe just to kind of wrap up on this section, I mentioned earlier that I used an algorithmic system to edit this work. So when I was doing this work, I usually work as a moving image artist and, and editing. When you use an editing software, basically you lay out the shots on what you call a timeline. But as I was researching onto time, I started to discover that for me, time is about multiplicity. There are multiple forms of time of different natures and different scales. And to reduce time to one timeline started to feel very violent to me. So I thought of a way, was trying to move away from the timeline to avoid this decision of like what is the most perfect timeline. And that's why we created a platform that enables us to edit the films kind of algorithmically and automatically so that what we are producing are multiple timelines. And so in ending, I will wrap up now with the final chapter, which is like very short. So we get to the third part, T for transformation. So basically, after the exhibition in Singapore at the Singapore Art Museum, and after finishing T for Time, which kind of like occupied me for 2.5 years, I was feeling actually completely exhausted, and empty. Yeah, but I was still going to the studio every day, and I travel with public transport, and I'm always kind of like reading on the train. And it just so happened that I started to read a poem by a book of poetry by a German poet called Rainer Maria Rilke. Yeah. I tried reading him actually in the last 15 years and couldn't get into it. But this time, in my state of exhaustion, I somehow feel like I received a great gift from Rainer Maria Rilke. It was almost as though the words connected to me across this like 100 years since he's passed on, and I felt this immediacy of kind of intense sensation. Yeah, I felt in a way like myself kind of like expanding, and I felt that things were possible once again. Yeah. So I'm going to skip all of this, and I just want to kind of like jump to a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, and I will end this talk by sharing this poem with you. So this is a poem that Rilke wrote, which is called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. I'm not a very good reader, but I will still try to share this poem with you. Just to give you a little bit of context. So in this poem, Rainer Maria Rilke is imagining a Greek torso, so a Greek kind of something like this, a fragment of a sculpture which is missing a head. And he imagines, he has an imaginary torso, and he starts to imagine the missing head of this imaginary torso. And this is what he says when he's kind of in this communication with this torso. We never knew his head and all the light that ripened in his fabled eyes. But his torso still burns like a street lamp dimmed, in which his gaze, lit long ago, holds fast and shines. Otherwise, the surge of the breast could not blind you, nor a smile run through the slight twist of the loins towards that center where procreation fled. Otherwise, this stone would stand cut off and cold under the shoulders, transparent drop, and not glisten like a wild beast's fur, and not break forth from all its contours like a star. For there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Yeah. So by looking at this imaginary head of this imaginary sculpture, he imagines that while looking at it, all of space is looking back at him, and he reaches just this final conclusion, which is that you must change your life. he does not say why or how we should change, must change. And I just want to end here. Sorry for taking up so much time. Thank you.
The same presentation or
I think,
longer than this?
yeah, perhaps Sue could comment on this, but we were really interested in the idea of seeing something in a different context. And I think this is also the idea of transformation. It might be very similar words, but with a kind of different resonance in a way. I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think I did slightly better on time here. So that was kind of my main mission. Yeah. So it is quite similar, I would say, but at the same time, because the context of New York and Bangkok are so different, so kind of it's interesting that by repeating, we also generate difference, because I'm sure the conversations that we are having today will be quite different to what we had in New York.
Right, and one reason that I was particularly interested in working with you on this talk is that we had obviously seen a lot of your work talked about through different lenses, particularly some of the work talked about through issues of post-colonial theory or reference to film theory and film history. I think all of these issues that we can obviously see in the Tiger in particular. But not so much really talking about your work from the spiritual angle. And I was just wondering kind of what your reactions were when we approached you with this concept, and what the process kind of has been like, or was it actually transformative or revelatory in some way?
Yeah, I think when I was approached by you and the foundation to do the talk, I must admit I was surprised, because in a way spirituality is not something, as you have already said, that occurs in the way that we have been discussing arts. But and to be perfectly honest, it struck me that like it was a very difficult task for me to have to speak about spirituality. So the difficulty of the challenge kind of like in a way it interested me. I was interested in why it was so difficult to speak about spirituality. Yeah.
Is it because you were not used to talking about that, or lacked a language to talk about that, or was it something you felt was very personal that perhaps you didn't want to talk about?
I would say this is still something that I am working through even now. This, the reason for that, and somehow I was thinking about this same question when we were in New York. And I felt that in New York, in a way, it was difficult to speak about spirituality because in some ways, with modernization and enlightenment, there's a kind of a drive towards the secular, right? So much of our artistic kind of like discourses, we speak about concepts, or if we speak about politics, it comes from a particular frame, yeah. And spirituality was kind of it was difficult to include spirituality within that frame. But now in Bangkok, as I'm thinking about the same question, I start to have a different set of answers. It seems almost as though in Bangkok, spirituality doesn't need to be spoken about in a particular sense because it is ever present, So this, in a way, kind of like connected to like that childhood memory, which I have not been thinking about these years. But it suddenly struck me that these are things that I grew up with, and that must have affected me quite profoundly at that age, right? So I don't know, but maybe.
Yeah, I was really struck the description of your uncle and that ritual. It reminded me of the weird tiger as well. Like maybe there's some great connectivity there that even drew you to the tiger.
Yes. I think that, and this kind of notion of, again, a medium, and a spirit kind of being able to pass through another body, So sometimes people ask me why I work so long and so many projects on tigers, and my instinctive response is always that I didn't choose to work with the tiger. I feel like the tiger chose
you.
me.
So actually, you were like contemporary wear tigers.
Yeah, like a non-mystical, non-magical, mediocre medium. Yes.
No, but I'm so happy, that you told us about your childhood memory. I think it kind of makes sense now because when you show us the photo of the medium that you saw, it reminds me of what we have in Phuket, right? During the J Festival. What is it? What do you call J Festival? The vegetarian festival. So there's like a kind of ritual in Phuket that they have that kind of, many things happening in the Chinese diaspora community. And so I kind of like struck the way you talk about time, in different variation of time. And the ideas of like peeling the apples, it's a bit similar to the perception of time in Thailand, which I always refer to, that we always live in the two type of time, which is one is the cyclical time, the idea of the reincarnation, and you see a lot in the Chappell's film, right? And also what happened in Thailand. Politically, we always have the cycle of the big C, like coup d'etat every 5 years. I always make fun in Germany you have every 5 years you have documenta, and in Thailand every 5 years we have coup d'etat. But this is like a joke, but it's very sad that it's kind of real, in a sense. This is the problem of Thailand, that we live in the cyclical world, the cyclical time, but in reality, time is very linear, right? And that's why I think this is pretty much interesting, and that's why many Thai artists still work in this kind of, the clash between the cyclical time and the linear time, which is still, debatable, and we can see it as problematic, but sometimes it's kind of inspired, the artists to tackle with. Yeah.
I think this is a lot of the connectivity between art and notions of time and spirituality. We often think of time as moving forward in this way, and the present moment is almost devoid of meaning because it's conditioned by the past and moving towards the present. This kind of breakthrough that many mystical traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, and others talk about of focusing on the moment as a kind of gateway to really the eternity that's really contained within the moment, and that focusing on that always keeps you connected with the transcendent. And I think this is also a role of the artwork, that it kind of breaks through this mundane process of time to bringing you into something that does have a transcendent component. I don't know if you feel that resonates with your work relating to time, but also the mystical component.
Yeah, I think, as I kind of like briefly mentioned earlier, like for me, after spending 2.5 years kind of like researching on various theories and concepts of time, of course I don't have the answer to the riddle of time. But what I arrived at was multiplicity, that there are different forms and shapes of time, and there is no hierarchy between them. So for me, the project was, in a sense, about coexistence, about this coexistence of these different times. And, just kind of pushing that a little bit, I would say, in terms of the spiritual, like for me, of course I don't exactly know what that is yet, but to me it must have something to do with this multiplicity and this coexistence of like these multiple types of time. Actually, there was an Indian physicist and mathematician called K.C. Raju. he wrote a book called 11 Pictures of Time, and he says that all the religions and scientific theories in the world, they all have an assumption about time having a particular kind of shape. And he says they can all be boiled down to these 11 different shapes, which is like quite interesting. So the spiral, the circle, the straight line.
But speaking about the Indian philosopher, I don't know if you read the book by Deepak Chakrabarty, in the provincializing Europe. He was talking about time, in a way that I found it so resonant to Thailand, because in Thailand we are very good at working against time, which is the idea of anachronism. If you look at what happened in Thailand, and I think this is another shade of times, in the history, right? So can I flash back to the old time of his work? I have because even though we don't have a chance to speak about the umbrella of this project, which is the Dictionary of Southeast Asia, but we always kind of, we know that Ho Tzu Nyen is a champion of Southeast Asia in a way, because when you, the first time, right, I already talked about his previous work, which is so much about the question of the birth of the nation, and also trying to create the counter narrative of the, the founder of Singapore, which is Raffles, right? And it was only 50 or less than 100 years ago. And then he traced back to 14th century, no, this is not Raffles. It is another guy, his name is Uttama. And that was the beginning of, it's really sparked my interest about Ho Tzu Nyen and his research. And so that with that piece, it was quite interesting to see how he moved from something pretty much national kind of centric, to a little bit broader, in a regional kind of perspective. Can we borrow T.K.'s Papati, ideas of regional perspective? And he slowly shifted to working the most difficult tasks in our region, just to answer the question of what is Southeast Asia, right? And we always make fun that Southeast Asia, ASEAN, it's totally unconstructed, the ideas from the Cold War. Southeast Asia is totally new, only like in 60 years ago, 50 years ago. And then we have ASEAN, 1967, the year that Jim Thompson disappeared. So what happened is, who needs Southeast Asia and ASEAN, right? In this neighborhood, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, we are so busy to clean up our remnants, in the backyard. But only Singapore, they're really, really obsessed with Southeast Asia and ASEAN. You have to tell me why.
That's a tough one. Thank you, Jack. Yeah, I think in a sense it's true that Singapore has always been very invested, like in Southeast Asia, for example, collecting Southeast Asian arts. So one of the biggest collections of Southeast Asian arts. Sometimes I think in a simplistic way, because Singapore is so small, so it has no choice but to look out. Yeah. But going back to the first work that you saw of mine, Sanglila Uttama, who is sort of the pre-colonial founder of Singapore, actually it was Uttama, it was researching on that project that got me interested in Southeast Asia. Because where does Sanglila Uttama, this mythical pre-colonial founder, come from? It is said that he has come from actually a part of Indonesia. Yeah. And so which is to say that to understand Singapore, it's not possible to understand it just on its own. You have to kind of look at the region. Yeah. And if you kind of go into the ancient Malay text about Sanglila Uttama, it is said that Sanglila Uttama descended from this Indonesian royalty, who are in turn descended from South Asian kings, from the Chola Empire, so this is India. And then it is said that these Chola kings were descended from Alexander the Great.
Again?
Yes.
Wow, this is
And-
interesting.
And in their genealogy, Alexander the Great is related to King Solomon, you know. So actually to trace the history of Singapore, it opens up to everything, you know. But kind of maybe just kind of back to Southeast Asia, you know. In a way, of course, Southeast Asia is constructed, but at the same time, there is also a reality to it after the construction, you know, and it has existed for almost half a century, yeah. So it starts to take on a reality. So it is both real and unreal at the same time. So for me, it's a little bit like the missing head of the torso that Rilke was writing about. It's a virtual object. You know, and what interests me is to think about this virtual object. And maybe just a last point, I think with Southeast Asia, after doing the project for a decade, the conclusion for me is that it's also a way to think about multiplicity because we are all different in Southeast Asia, but we coexist. And our coexistence is not independent because we resonate with each other. Sometimes in ways that are not logical, but there's a kind of resonance and connection, you know. So thinking about Southeast Asia was also thinking about multiplicity, like this coexistence, which in a way for me is tied to the spiritual. Yeah.
Is that something you feel like is part of your artistic creativity or process, something motivates you in some way, do you think?
I would say our own motivations, in a sense as an artist, we don't know what motivates us, and sometimes we produce work in order to understand these motivations. But I would say increasingly these thoughts have been kind of like on my mind with more and more projects.
Yeah, speaking about the project, and motivation, because you are the one who watched a lot of film. You remember when we spoke about like so many, he has been working a lot with the film by Tony Leung or Liang Xiaowei. And maybe you can share with us about when you, like how many films and a shot that you have to work with Liang Xiaowei, right? And then one time he came to see your show.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, maybe you can explain, because I remember that we worked together one project, very beautiful project in Gwangju. It was one of the pieces that, we have Liang Xiaowei in it. And it's kind of related to Bangkok at some point.
Yeah, so the project that Jiap is speaking about is called The Nameless. And it's a work about an actual historical figure called Lai Tek. Lai Tek is one of his 30 known names. Up to today, we don't know his real name. We only know that he is Vietnamese, and he became the leader of the Malayan Communist Party from 1939 to 1947. And today, we also know that he's a triple agent. Yeah. So he was working for working for the French, the English, and the Japanese secret police while being the leader of the communists. So if we speak about coexistence of multiplicity, this is embodied in this figure. And I wanted to make a film about him, and I wanted to use my favorite actor, who is Tony Leung Chiwai, who acts in all of Wong Kar-wai's films. But I couldn't afford the fees. So I used all of his films from the last 30 years and recut that into a film about Lai Tek. And Tony Leung has acted in many films where he's cast as an informer or double agent or traitor. And he even acted in a Vietnamese film, Cycle, which was an amazing film. So everything kind of like connected. Yeah.
But you told me that he didn't say anything, right, when he saw his film?
I didn't dare to ask too much, but I haven't been sued yet by him or Wong Kar-wai, which is thank you, Wong Kar-wai.
You have more questions? Yeah, speaking about the project, because I want to ask you, what are you working on at the moment, and you do have some time to rest?
no rest. Yes. So actually, I would say the project that or the research question that interests me now has in many ways something to do with my little experience with just this sense of like feeling that things are possible. So I started getting interested in the question of like, what is power? Because that experience for me was a feeling of a kind of power. But today, when we mention the word power, we intuitively and immediately think about power as something which is external and which is exercised over other people. This is inevitable because of the terrible times that we live in. And I would say that concept of power in a way is a sociological concept of power. Yeah. And around the same time when I was reading Rilke, I found out that he was a fan of a Dutch philosopher called Spinoza. And I started reading Spinoza, and Spinoza has a beautiful concept of power. He says power is the capacity of the body to be affected. And I found this so radical because now power is not directed externally, but it's about internal capacity, you know. And this power is not actual, it's not used, it is a kind of potential, because that is what capacity is a potential power. And just to end off, and for Spinoza, who's actually a very political and utopian thinker, this understanding of power is virtual power, but this power becomes actual only when we enter into a social relationship. And he says that what makes a social body healthy is that we each amplify each other's power rather than curbing and controlling each other's power. So I started getting interested in different ways of thinking and imagining what is power. Yeah.
It's going to be a new project.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask him, because he's working with the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia, how are you going to pick the alphabet, what is the rationale behind it, right? Because every single project, you have T, we work together in Shanghai, and this is, I invite him to show the work in the Golden Triangle, come on, you have to do something about opium, and I think it was so many, 26 words, and sometimes you repeat it, and sometimes any single alphabet that you never touch.
Yeah, many I didn't touch because I spent about 5 to 6 years working on tigers. Tigers. So tigers ate up all my time.
Yes. Yeah.
So
you like that photo of tigers and
with the
that
tail.
the tail.
Yeah. So sometimes I decide to work on a specific term because of external situation. So sometimes, because of your invitation, I start thinking about O, which is O for opium. So sometimes the external event kind of sparks me to do something. Yeah. So maybe I will also call the project on power P for power. So we can keep on.
Yeah, the next project. So if you guys want to commission him, so it's still available. I think we tell you have another questions. Otherwise, we give the floor. Yeah. If you guys want to comment, or questions, or invitation to us, please do.
I'm curious, during the project about White Tiger, in your term, you found out this is the gender of the White Tiger in South Asia?
The gender, yeah.
The gender.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, according to most of my research, it's almost always a male. In the kind of the Malay histories or or folklore connected to the were-tiger. Yeah. Sometimes the were-tiger is a shaman. Sometimes it's a merchant, like a traveling merchant. Sometimes it's a beggar. Yeah. So sometimes they say people of royal blood as well have this ability to turn into tigers, but it's always figures who are not really located in one place, or figures who are a little bit outside of like normal human society. Yeah.
Sorry, continue a little bit. Last time I read this book in Reading Room and in Bangkok. I found this is the donation book and found a small short story about the white were-tiger from China, and she is the good spirit.
Yes.
She is mean female.
Yes.
So it's quite struggle to me because I also heard this most of were-tiger in Indonesia are men.
Yes.
But when it's to be a mythology were-tiger, like a white spirit or something like that, not about the good, right? I mean, about the good thing is to be like a female.
Yes.
That quite strange for me.
Yes.
What is the problem?
I think it makes kind of perfect sense too. That what you mentioned. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's almost all accounts I have come across. It's always a male figure. So.
Hi, thanks so much for talk. Just a question or opening for discussion on the clock piece that you have, that you try to save them, and you were talking about you want to make it forever. I want to get into what is forever for you. Is eternity or just immortal, or it is for you?
Yeah.
We don't talk about Sian
That's a good question that I didn't think that far when I spoke about it. Yeah. But if I were to respond now, somehow for me, as long as the two clocks are working in sync, there is a kind of eternity there. When the two clocks are in sync. Yeah. So I don't really think about, if this work doesn't, if I lose this work for whatever reason, it doesn't matter to me. As long as there was a moment in which the two clocks were in sync, there is already a kind of eternity there. Yeah.
This is really interesting because sometimes when I think something in sync and stay forever is almost like the thing of like deathless. You never die, but it doesn't mean you eternity. Because I feel like eternity doesn't have beginning or ending in some way.
Yes.
But the suspension of something, the force of sync, to be able to keep going from the human hand, in some way for me is, it's kind of the mortal work, the immortality of the hand of the mortal.
Yeah.
It's kind of,
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions? Win. That's it. ไม่มีกระดาษหมดแล้ว That's it. Oh, it's 8 p.m.
Just nice on time.
Wow. More questions?
มีคำถามอีกไหมคะ
One more question.
I'd just like to ask again the name of the Argentinian poet you mentioned earlier.
Borges, Borges. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
อนนะ
I'm just curious. We're talking about spirituality when you said you were in New York, it's really different. What about when you are in Singapore? What do you think about spirituality?
That's actually, I was also thinking the same question today. Yeah. So Singapore, I would say, is a kind of interesting, strange case. Yeah. So many aspects of Singapore, when we think about it, we immediately think it's very pragmatic, very efficient, very highly rational. But at the same time, that like my own childhood experience with this medium, this is, I would say, something quite common. So we have many mediums actually who are still operating, still working, and in these kind of domestic settings is quite common actually in Singapore. So it's almost as though there's there's like two Singapores in a way. Yeah, there is that efficient, rational model, and there is this other side which never goes away. So and they kind of coexist at some point. So like I said, these are still kind of like questions I am still kind of like working through. Yeah. So in that sense, I would say Singapore is still part of Southeast Asia.
Come on, you are
Yes.
Southeast Asia.
Because of this type of resonance, and maybe it's something that becomes hard to speak about, in a way because we, especially after modernity, we don't have the language to speak about it in the arts, right? Like, we much of our critical language and critical tools, as Tyler, you use the word materialists, yeah. So, but they are still there, So.
And what role does the artist play in this sort of as a tiger or as a medium?
I would in a way say that the closest I would think of is something close to a medium, in the sense that, at least for myself, I think that what I do is in some sense just a channeling of like forces that are larger than me. Sometimes these forces, of course, are historical and political, but surely there are other types of forces. Yeah.
And how do you go about sort of channeling that? Is it something just letting go, or do you feel something pushing you?
Yeah.
In order to make the art, do you feel there's how do you actually channel?
Yeah, I think I'm sure every artist must have their own method. So I can only speak about myself. So when I work on a project, usually it takes time because I want to, in a way, live in that world. And to live in that world, I do, in a way, research. But the research is not about it's not just about finding facts or coming up with an argument. For me, the process of research is actually a way to live in that world. So I'm kind of living in that. For example, between 2019 to 2021, I was making 3 projects about Japanese wartime histories and a group of philosophers called the Kyoto School. So for those 3 years, I was living in that world. I'm sure I was imaginatively reconstructing that world and living. Like, I want to be able to dream in that world, So I think it's a way of letting these things come inside, enter me, and making sense of it. I'm not so sure if that's the best word, but when the deadline comes and I have to produce a work, you in a way have to channel it out, and you have to find a form, and I think the form allows me to escape like language, so I don't have to explain like in a logical kind of linear way how I make sense, right? But rather making sense in art is about sensations and sense and form. So so I kind of understand my own processes as such.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in your talk, you didn't make a lot of big pronouncements about spirituality or what it all means, but rather was focusing on your particular artworks and kind of drawing us deeper into them, that we kind of get a feeling of what you're talking about without actually producing a treatise about spirituality.
Yes, thank you for that observation. I think this is as far as I can get to thinking about this question and thinking about how to speak about it in our current, the state of our kind of discourse in the arts. Yeah. So it's still a strategy that I'm kind of working through. So maybe just to also share a thought, right, which is in many ways it's easy to speak about spirituality if we think about it as a kind of as history. So we can speak about how certain indigenous thoughts was erased or covered up by the encroachment, let's say, of Western enlightenment and rational thoughts, right? So in a way, this is speaking about spirituality in a historical way. And these type of conversations, in a way, are easy to have in the art setting. So but to speak about spirituality directly, that is very difficult, So I think we can speak about spirituality in an indirect way. It's easier through these kind of historical questions and post-colonial discourses. So we also speak about spirituality, I would say in a sense, in the negative, that it was something lost, something erased. But to speak about it positively, which I think, in a sense, your foundations, what is interesting to me is that you are putting it out there to how do we speak about this thing head on directly, right?
Right, I think it's a matter of changing paradigms. And we were talking earlier about the modernist paradigm, which was very rigid, linear sense of time and geographical centrality of certain European and American centers of modernism and the periphery of sort of subsidiary modernisms that were derivative in other parts of the world. This kind of narrative has been completely broken down, and I think we see a greater enrichment of our conception of art by really appreciating the blossoming of modernism around the world. I do think this one strong pillar of the modernist project relating to spirituality and religion as something that would be inevitably left behind as we progress forward into this very secular age, that the spiritual is something of the past, maybe archaic, primitive. I think there's still a lot of this way of looking at it, but it's interesting that we sort of still hold sometimes to that belief that, and that there's a certain fear perhaps that it will be going backwards instead of forwards. There's still this idea of moving forwards towards something instead of, as I think some of what you pointed out today, of just focusing on the moment and every second of time is not a progression, but is also a world in itself, which is a kind of a mystical view as well.
Yeah, I think if you spoke about, the modernism, in that was kind of production and outcome of the Enlightenment, and what you are doing in America, is very interesting. Like you trying to kind of go against those mainstream narrative of, being like irrational or being like primitive, believe in spiritualism, and as, animistic, it's kind of like irrational. But I think what we did right now, in this kind of post-colonial and the postmodern discourse is like, we know that the modernist is a problem, right? So that's why we have to go back to the past, and especially in the past 10 or 20 years, you see so many indigenous artists, or indigenous curator, was like everywhere. Like for example, in the last Venice Biennale, like Corena everywhere. And in the next edition, the curator is an African American lady. For the documentary also the same. So we are up to the point that the white male has a problem, like where are we? There has no place, in the art world now. But I think it's quite interesting, like to go back to the ideas of superstitious spiritualism, aka animism. It's almost like become a language of the artists from the post-colonial country, and even for us, even though we are like never being colonized, right? But in another argument of Thailand now is like we are internal colonized by the elite, right? So this is like how many Thai artists and Southeast Asian artists use these vocabulary, use these languages to kind of redefine ourselves, just to understand that, wait, this is like, it's not a clear cut, we've never been modern. As Bruno Latour said, modernism is a myth. In Thailand, we have become postmodern before we being modern. We are very animistic, we are very superstitious. I admit that we don't speak about spirituality, but we perform. We perform in the daily life, okay? We perform in politics, we perform in economics. Like you have to go see before the coup d'etat, they would consult fortune teller. Believe me, Thailand and Burma, we use the same fortune teller before they stage the coup d'etat, okay?
And
so
you
this is the
also
thing.
see that reflected in art, I think. Performance art here has a very different context and a different power to it than in other parts of the world, and it's the same, I think, with video and others. I mean, how do you, because your work is shown all over the world in many different contexts, even though is it produced in one context, or do you feel that it's kind of
relevant.
Something that is more global in origin?
Yeah, I mean, I would say definitely the specific context is a point of focus for me, but at the same time, it only interests me because I feel like there is with the subjects I'm dealing with, that there's a resonance outside of the local context. Sometimes it's difficult for me to articulate exactly what the resonance is, but I would say it's something I intuitively feel. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about revolution, because you were talking about this repetition of the coup d'etat. But revolution as a word, it basically is a full circle, and it returns, right? So so in a way, revolution is cyclical. But I would say, like, maybe during the French Revolution, there was the notion that the revolution itself has changed. So you can now break time by, for example, what they did, which was they beheaded the kings, right? And that ruptures time.
They started a new way of counting time,
yes,
like a ground zero.
Exactly, as a kind of a straight line.
This is a French context, okay?
Yes. So, yeah.
Right. So, and then how do you feel in different contexts where your work is sort of labeled in certain ways, like this work is a political or post-colonial work, or this work is about film theory, or how do you feel about these different sort of narratives kind of framing the way people even come to your work, the expectations?
Yeah, actually, in a way, I welcome all frames. Yeah, And it's not just kind of like being about open, but at some level, all of this interests me. And there were things that kind of passed through my mind as I was working on it. It's just that the work has many different like layers and is capable of many different frames. And maybe even I would say that the kind of work that interests me is precisely that it's open for all these different kind of like perspectives.
Do you feel it really has a center, or is it all just layers, or what is at the core?
Yeah, I would say the core is made up of, in a way, if you want to imagine it, like stacks of all of these layers. Yeah. So I don't really think about a core as like a kind of solid, central core. For me, what interests me is exactly this multiplicities and how these multiplicities relate to each other as a kind of larger form. Yeah. So it's...
Because you see that in your work in a physical sense. You have multiple screens or things behind screens, and a sense that there's not one clear way of looking at one thing, but there's always a different perspective, and you sort of force the viewer into that.
Yes, exactly. And I would say the dictionary and using the algorithmic systems is also to continuously produce like this type of different versions. So instead of one version of what is Southeast Asia, it's more about generating a multiplicity of possible versions.
Yeah, so it reminds me of the ideas of when we did the open world, and there was a video game called the Open World Games, and it's allowed people to approach the characters in a different multiple kind of perspective, and it's pretty non-linear. And I think this is a very interesting character of your work, and we are so happy that you shared with us today. I think we should end now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have beverage in the back of the room, and we